Okay, so get this Project 2025.
Yeah,
It's causing a lot of buzz,
big time.
and we've got a stack of research and articles and opinions about it.
Yeah, we've got think pieces, op-eds, policy papers, the whole nine yards.
So let's dive in and see what we can uncover.
Sounds good.
So what is Project 2025?
Well, basically, you can think of it as a blueprint
Oh.
for a conservative vision of America's future, and it's really impressive, actually, the sheer scale of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the Heritage Foundation is the main driver behind it, but they've got over 100 different conservative groups who have collaborated on this thing.
Wow, 100.
It's huge, and they're clearly aiming for 2025 as the launch date.
I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer with a name like Project 2025.
Right, exactly.
But here's the thing. It's not just about politics.
No.
This goes way beyond that. We're talking about potential changes to, like, everything.
Oh, yeah.
Education, healthcare, even how our government works.
Like some of the stuff they're proposing is pretty radical.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into the specifics of all that.
Definitely.
But first, let's start with one of the core ideas behind Project 2025, this whole notion of smaller government.
Right, the idea that the federal government has just gotten too big, too powerful.
Too intrusive,
Exactly.
stifling individual liberty and economic growth.
They basically argue that government is the problem.
It's a very classic conservative argument, right?
Oh, yeah. It goes all the way back to Reagan.
But what does that actually look like in practice? Like, how do you actually shrink the government?
Well, they're proposing some pretty bold restructuring, like eliminating entire federal agencies.
Well, okay, like what?
Like the Department of Education, for example.
Really? The entire Department of Education?
Yep, gone.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal, right?
Huge. I mean, think about it. The federal government plays a massive role in education right now.
Yeah. Funding standards, curriculum, all that.
So getting rid of the Department of Education would completely change the landscape.
Wow, so that's definitely one way to shrink the government.
Mm-hmm.
Just completely eliminate a whole department.
Right. And it's a very controversial proposal, obviously.
Oh, I bet.
I mean, people have very strong opinions about the role of the federal government in education.
For sure.
You know, some people think it's absolutely essential to ensure quality and equity.
Right.
And others think it's a massive overreach and that education should be left to the states.
So it's a debate that's been going on for a long time.
Oh, yeah, for decades. And
Oh.
this proposal just brings it right back to the forefront.
And it's not just about education, right?
No,
This smaller government idea extends to the economy as well.
absolutely.
We see a lot of talk about tax cuts, simplifying the tax code,
Mm-hmm.
basically putting more money back in people's pockets.
Yeah, they argue that it'll stimulate the economy, encourage investment, create jobs.
So it's basically trickle-down economics, right?
Pretty much.
Hasn't that been tried before?
Well, yeah.
I mean, with mixed results, to say the least.
Right, and that's what the critics are quick to point out.
Okay, so what are some of the criticisms?
Well, they argue that these tax cuts will primarily benefit the wealthy
Okay,
at the expense of social programs and public services.
so like education, healthcare, infrastructure.
Exactly. They worry that we'll see cuts to those areas.
Which could actually end up hurting the economy in the long run.
That's their argument. They say it'll undermine the very foundations of a thriving society.
So it's a classic clash of economic philosophies, right?
Yep. And the stakes are high because we're talking about people's livelihoods, their well-being.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about education specifically.
Okay.
Because Project 2025 is pushing for a big change there too.
Huge.
School choice.
Yeah, school choice is a big part of their plan.
And the idea is to give parents more control over their children's education
Right.
by providing vouchers that they can use to send their kids to private or charter schools.
Exactly.
So more options for parents, more competition among schools.
In theory, it sounds great, right?
Yeah, but I can already hear the critics.
Oh, yeah. They're not shy about voicing their concerns.
So what are they worried about?
Well, the main concern is that it'll exacerbate inequalities.
Okay.
They argue that families who are already well off will be able to take advantage of these vouchers.
Right.
Send their kids to fancy private schools.
While disadvantaged students are left behind in underfunded public school,
Exactly. They worry that it'll create a two-tiered system.
which would be bad for everyone in the long run.
Right, because a strong public education system benefits society as a whole.
So it's another complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
Definitely.
And Project 2025 is full of these complex issues.
Oh, yeah, it's a sweeping plan. It touches on almost every aspect of government.
And they're not just talking about ideas.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have a plan for how they would implement all of this.
Right. They've thought about the logistics, the nuts and bolts of how to actually make this happen.
Which is pretty impressive, actually.
It is. I mean, they've created this massive database of potential conservative appointees.
Whoa. Okay, so they've got like a list of people ready to fill all these government positions.
Yeah, like a whole shadow government just waiting in the wings.
So if a conservative president is elected in 2025,
They can hit the ground running.
wow, that's pretty remarkable.
It is. I mean, it shows a level of planning and organization that we haven't really seen before.
But I can't help but wonder, doesn't that raise some concerns about potential bias?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, are we talking about the best and brightest or just the most ideologically aligned?
That's a valid question, and it's one that critics are raising.
Okay, so they're worried that this could lead to a less qualified government workforce,
Right. They argue that competence and experience should be the main criteria.
not just loyalty to a particular ideology.
Exactly. They also worry that this pre-selected pool of candidates might not be very diverse.
So maybe not representative of the American people as a whole.
Right. And that's a concern because diversity of perspectives is important for good governance.
Absolutely. So it seems like there's a potential trade-off here
Yeah.
between efficiency and inclusivity.
You could say it.
And it's not just about picking names, right? They're actually actively preparing these folks for their future roles.
Right. Think of it like boot camp for government officials.
So they're getting training on policy, on procedure, on the Project 2025 agenda.
Exactly. They're being groomed to step right into these positions and start implementing the plan.
And they've even got a detailed 180-day playbook.
Oh, yeah. A step-by-step guide for the first 6 months of a new conservative administration.
So it's like they've got it all mapped out.
Pretty much.
I mean, that's impressive on the one hand, but also kind of makes me uneasy.
How so?
Well, what happens if the world throws them a curveball?
Mhm.
Like a sudden economic crisis,
Yeah.
a global pandemic, or something completely unforeseen?
Right.
Will they be able to adapt, or are they locked into this rigid plan that might not be appropriate for the situation?
That's a good point. I mean, governing often requires flexibility, improvisation, the ability to think on your feet.
Exactly.
And it remains to be seen whether the individuals chosen through this process will possess those qualities.
So we've got a bold vision for a smaller government sweeping economic reforms, a radical shakeup of education, and this meticulously planned transition process.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
And that's just the beginning, because we haven't even touched on the criticisms of Project 2025 yet.
Oh, yeah, there's a whole other side to this story.
And we'll dive into that in our next episode.
Stay tuned, folks. Things are about to get interesting. So where were we?
Right, we were about to dig into some of the criticisms of Project 2025.
Okay, yeah, because it's definitely not without its critics.
Right, it seems like it's stirring up quite a bit of controversy.
Big time. And some of the concerns are pretty serious.
Like what? What are people worried about?
Well, for starters, there are concerns about its potential impact on democracy and civil liberties.
Okay, so how could it threaten democracy?
Well, some critics argue that it concentrates too much power in the executive branch.
Okay.
They point to the project's support for a broad interpretation of something called the unitary executive theory.
Unitary executive theory. That sounds
Yeah.
complicated.
It's a legal theory about presidential power.
Okay.
And basically it argues that the president has almost unchecked power over the executive branch.
So less oversight from Congress or the courts?
Right, and critics worry that this could lead to an imbalance of power.
Yeah, that classic checks and balances thing.
Exactly. They argue that it could erode those checks and balances and undermine the rule of law.
So less accountability, less transparency.
Right, and that's a recipe for abuse of power.
So it's not just about abstract legal theories, right?
No.
There are specific proposals in Project 2025 that are raising red flags.
Right, like the proposal to reclassify thousands of federal workers as political appointees.
Okay, so these are career civil servants we're talking about, right?
Exactly, people who are supposed to be nonpartisan and focused on serving the public good.
But they could be replaced by political loyalists,
That's the concern.
which could lead to a lot of problems, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, imagine a government where expertise and experience take a backseat to political ideology.
That sounds pretty scary, actually.
It could undermine the effectiveness and impartiality of the entire federal bureaucracy.
So we've got concerns about democracy, concerns about the potential for abuse of power.
Right.
What about individual rights? Are there concerns that Project 2025 could erode civil liberties?
Definitely, critics argue that some of its proposals would disproportionately harm marginalized groups.
Okay, like who?
Well, for example, there are proposals targeting LGBTQ plus rights,
Okay.
rolling back protections, limiting their rights.
And what about reproductive rights?
There are concerns there, too. They propose restricting access to reproductive health care, including abortion and contraception.
Which would obviously have a huge impact on women's lives.
Absolutely, and it highlights the deep divisions in our society over these issues.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like Project 2025 is really forcing us to confront some fundamental questions about our values.
It is, what does it mean to be an American? What rights and freedoms should be protected?
And who gets to decide?
Exactly. These are big questions, and Project 2025 is pushing them right to the forefront of the national conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about concerns about democracy, civil liberties values.
Right.
But let's get into the specifics of some of the policy proposals,
Okay.
because there are some pretty controversial ones in there.
Oh, yeah. Where do we even begin?
How about education?
Okay. Yeah, education's a big one.
They want to dismantle the Department of Education right,
Yep. Completely eliminate it.
which is a pretty radical idea.
It is. And they also want to cut funding for a lot of programs.
Like Head Start
Yeah, Head Start, which helps low-income children prepare for school.
and Title I funding.
Right, which provides extra resources to schools in disadvantaged communities.
So these are programs that are designed to help level the playing field.
Exactly. But proponents of Project 2025 argue that they're ineffective and represent federal overreach.
So they think the government should just get out of the education business altogether.
Pretty much, they believe that education should be primarily a state and local issue.
Which would obviously have a huge impact on how schools are funded and run.
It would, and critics argue that it would exacerbate inequalities in the education system.
Okay, so the debate over the role of government in education continues.
It's a long-standing debate, and Project 2025 just throws more fuel on the fire.
And it's not just education, they're targeting healthcare as well.
Right, healthcare is another big one.
And specifically reproductive healthcare,
Yeah, they have some very specific proposals on abortion and contraception.
which has sparked a lot of outrage.
Definitely, they're calling for some pretty drastic changes.
Like what?
Well, for one, they want to withdraw FDA approval for the abortion pill mifepristone.
Really? Completely ban it?
That's what they're proposing, even in states where abortion is legal.
Wow, that would have a huge impact on women's access to abortion,
It would make it much harder for women to obtain medication abortion.
which is currently the most common method of abortion in the U.S.
Exactly.
So it's a pretty significant escalation in the fight over abortion rights.
No doubt about it.
And they don't stop there, right?
No. They also suggest using existing laws to prevent the distribution of mifepristone through the mail
Okay.
and excluding emergency contraception from mandated health insurance coverage.
Wow, so basically making it harder for women to access any form of contraception?
Pretty much. And critics are arguing that these proposals would disproportionately harm low-income women and women of color.
Who already face significant barriers to health care.
Exactly. It's a matter of reproductive justice.
That's a very complex issue with strong feelings on both sides.
Yeah, and Project 2025 is definitely not shying away from these controversial topics.
Okay, so we've got potential threats to democracy, concerns about civil liberties, drastic cuts to education, and healthcare restrictions on reproductive rights.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And there's one more layer to this that we need to discuss.
What's that?
The whole Christian nationalism thing.
Ah, yes, that's a big one too.
I've heard people talking about it, but I'm not really sure what it means.
Okay, so Christian nationalism is a pretty complex ideology. But basically, it's the idea that America is a Christian nation
Okay.
and that its laws and policies should be based on Christian values.
So it's like mixing religion and politics.
Exactly. And critics worry that this could lead to discrimination against people who don't share those Christian values.
Right, because America's supposed to be a country where everyone is free to practice their own religion.
Or no religion at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does this tie into Project 2025?
Well, critics argue that many of the proposals in Project 2025 align with a Christian nationalist agenda.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure. For example, the plan calls for infusing government and society with conservative Christian values.
Okay.
They want to promote a biblically based definition of marriage and family,
Okay.
and they want to prioritize religious freedom for Christians.
Which sounds good on the surface.
Yeah, but critics worry that it could be used to justify discrimination against LGBTQ plus people
Right.
and other minority groups.
So it's like using religious freedom as a shield for discrimination.
That's the concern, and it raises questions about whether Project 2025 is truly committed to the principle of separation of church and state.
Which is a pretty fundamental principle of American democracy.
It is, and it's one that's being hotly debated right now.
So we've got a lot to think about here.
We do.
We've got potential threats to democracy, Concerns about civil liberties, controversial proposals on education, healthcare, social issues.
And now this whole debate about Christian nationalism.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's important to be aware of these issues because they have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And we'll continue to explore these consequences in our next episode.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Fears about democracy, concerns about civil liberties, those controversial proposals on education, healthcare, social issues, and then the whole debate about Christian nationalism.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. And we haven't even touched on the potential political fallout from all of this. I mean, Project 2025's got to be causing some waves in the political world, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly divisive. I mean, it's got enthusiastic support from a lot of conservatives, but it's also triggered a wave of opposition from Democrats, progressives, even some moderates.
So it's become a political football league.
Pretty much, Democrats have been using it to attack Trump and other conservative politicians. You know, they're saying this is what the Republican Party stands for. These are the kinds of policies they want to implement.
So it's become a campaign issue?
Definitely. It's a way to mobilize voters who are concerned about the direction of the country.
Okay, so it's a political hot potato, but what about the actual impact on people's lives?
Right, because that's what really matters at the end of the day.
Exactly. I mean, we can talk about all these big abstract ideas, but how would Project 2025 actually affect people in their everyday lives?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And it's one that we need to try to answer.
Yeah, because policies have real-world consequences.
So let's try to connect those dots.
Okay.
If Project 2025 were to be implemented, how might it actually change people's lives?
Well, let's start with education.
Okay.
We talked about the proposal to dismantle the Department of Education and shift towards school choice.
Right. Giving parents more control with those vouchers.
Exactly. Now, for some families, this could be a good thing.
Okay.
You know, they might have more options. They might be able to send their kids to better schools.
Especially if they're already dissatisfied with their local public schools.
Right. But the big question is, what happens to the families who can't afford those private school tuition costs, even with vouchers?
Right, because private schools can be really expensive.
They can, and that's the worry, that this could create a two-tiered education system.
Where wealthy kids get a great education.
And poor kids get left behind.
Which would be bad for everyone in the long run.
Exactly. A strong public education system benefits society as a whole.
Okay, so that's education. What about healthcare?
All right, well, we talked about those controversial proposals on abortion and contraception.
Yeah, like banning the abortion pill mifepristone.
Right, which would make it much harder for women to access abortion care.
Right, especially in states where abortion is already restricted.
Exactly. It would create a lot of logistical and financial barriers.
And what about the proposal to exclude emergency contraception from health insurance coverage?
Well, that would make it more expensive for women to access emergency contraception.
Which could lead to more unintended pregnancies.
Right, and that has a ripple effect. You know, it affects women's health, their education, their careers, their financial security.
So it's not just about one medical procedure, it's about a whole range of consequences.
That's right. It's about women's control over their own bodies and their own lives.
Okay, so education, healthcare. What about the economy? How might those proposed tax cuts and deregulation affect people's wallets?
Well, it's complicated. You know, there's a lot of debate about whether those trickle-down economics actually work.
Right, because the idea is that if businesses have more money,
they'll create more jobs and everyone will benefit.
But critics worry that the benefits will mostly go to the wealthy.
Right. They argue that it'll exacerbate income inequality.
And that it could lead to cuts in social programs that help middle-class and low-income families.
Exactly. So it's a classic debate about the role of government in the economy.
Should the government prioritize economic growth or social welfare?
And there's no easy answer.
No, there isn't. And we haven't even talked about the potential impact on the environment.
Oh, yeah, that's another big concern.
Project 2025 calls for a lot of deregulation.
It does. They want to roll back a lot of environmental protections.
Which could have some pretty serious consequences.
Like what?
Well, think about air pollution, water pollution, climate change.
Right, those are all major issues, and critics argue that deregulation could make them worse.
It's like putting short-term economic gains ahead of long-term environmental sustainability.
And that's a trade-off that a lot of people are uncomfortable with.
It seems like Project 2025 is forcing us to confront some really tough choices.
It is. It's making us think about our priorities as a nation.
What do we value most? Economic growth, individual liberty, social justice, environmental protection.
And how do we balance those competing values?
It's a conversation that we need to have as a society.
Absolutely. And it's not an easy conversation.
No, it's not, but it's an important one.
And it's one that we need to have in a thoughtful and respectful way.
Even though we might disagree with each other.
Exactly, because that's what democracy is all about.
So that's Project 2025, a bold vision for a conservative future.
With far-reaching implications.
It's sparking debate, it's raising questions, and it's forcing us to confront some of the most pressing challenges facing our nation.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Project 2025.
We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit unsettling.
And we hope you'll continue to engage with these ideas as we all navigate the uncharted waters ahead.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.